Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm reading through a bit more of the Easter story, and we're going to cover a big chunk from Gethsemane all the way up to Peter's denial and Jesus being questioned by the Sanhedrin. It's going to be another long one, so let's jump right into it. Okay, so continuing on with Mark chapter 14, verse 32, Gethsemane. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Now, if Peter, James, and John were left behind, and he went on a little further, who was there to see this prayer? How can we know what Jesus was saying here if he was alone? If he was completely alone, by the story's own admission, there was no one witnessing it. How do we know? Verse 37, "Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. 'Simon,' he said to Peter, 'are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak.'" See, and here, obviously these disciples were asleep, so they couldn't have heard his prayer earlier. And also, this is showing Mark's Jesus is a very human Jesus. Mark had an adoptionist viewpoint of Jesus, where he wasn't always the Son of God. He was adopted as God's Son at his baptism with John the Baptist. And it really shows through here in the story of Gethsemane. Is Jesus, he knows what's coming. He knows he's about to die, and he is absolutely in agony over this. Now, if he was actually God incarnate, as we'll see later when we read John's version of Gethsemane, that'd be no problem. Like I'm God. I'm down on earth for a bad weekend. I know it's going to be a bad weekend, but I'll get over it. I'll be in heaven the next day. This is a human Jesus. I don't know what's going to happen to me after I'm crucified. I just know I'm going to be suffering a lot in the next few hours. So he is if you read this with the idea that Jesus is human, this is actually a very touching story. It's a very moving story, and Mark was actually a very, very good author. He wrote beautifully. He used all sorts of allegorical references to various other scriptures in just an absolutely gorgeous way. And if you understand that, the book of Mark is it looks like literary genius. But if you're taking it as literal truth, it takes away from the quality of the book if you're thinking that this is a literal event. So, anywho, continuing on with verse 39. "Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer.'" Now, moving on to Luke's version of Gethsemane, it's a lot shorter than Mark's, and you'll see there are a couple key differences here. So we got, starting with chapter 22, verse 39. Jesus prays on the Mount of Olives. So in Luke, it doesn't actually call it Gethsemane, it's on the Mount of Olives. Now, Gethsemane could be a garden on the Mount of Olives, so I'm not going to say that that's a contradiction, but it's a difference. So verse 39, "Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you will not fall into temptation.' He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, 'Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done.'" So again, he's leaving the disciples. He is a stone's throw away, so I guess it could be argued that one of the disciples could have overheard that. But, it does specify later that they did fall asleep again. So there's really no witnesses to this one either. "An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." So in this version, it's a little bit more miraculous. There's an angel coming to make him feel better. So again, this is a very human Jesus that is in anguish. If he was God, there'd be no reason for him to be stressing out because he knows how it's going to turn out and he knows it'll be just a temporary thing. And, for someone that has an existence that is literally an eternity, a day on the cross and then a couple days being dead is nothing. It's literally nothing. So there's no reason for him to be in anguish if he is God. But if he is a man, then absolutely this makes perfect sense. But again, we see Luke is adding in that there's an angel from heaven, so there's a bit more supernaturalness going on in Luke. So verse 45, when he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping? He asked them. Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. And that's the end of that section. The next is Jesus arrested. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But for now, we will move on to Matthew's account of Gethsemane. So from Matthew's version of Gethsemane, we're starting in chapter 26, verse 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, Sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, My Father, if it is not possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. So, again, nobody to witness this, so nobody could tell exactly what Jesus was saying. And also, he says, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. That's suggesting that it might be impossible for God to take the cup from him. We'll get more into that in just a moment. So, verse 40, then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter, Watch with me and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. So, Jesus, the Son of God, remember, so unless you're an adoptionist, which they're a very rare breed nowadays, Jesus is God. Jesus and God are the same person. So he is asking that he not have to be crucified. And he's saying, if it's not possible, then I'll do it. And earlier he said, if it is possible, please take it away. Now he is God. And God is God. So he's talking to himself about this. So if it was possible for God to do this another way, then God would have done it another way because he's asking himself to do it another way. But that's in direct contradiction to what he said in Mark. So going back, that's Mark chapter 14, verse 36. Everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. So Mark is implying that it is possible for God to take this cup away from him and do it a different way, but he's willing to submit himself to God's will, which I think that's a terrible will to have. They will, like, oh, you must die so that these people can be saved. Like, I think that's a horrible thing to do. But Mark is at least admitting that, all things are possible with you, but I understand if you want to do it this way, I'll do it for you anyways. What Matthew is saying is that, he's coming right out and saying, if it's not possible, I'll do it. And if it is possible, please do it a different way. Which, again, that's actually in direct contradiction with a verse earlier in Matthew as well. Because you could argue that if there's a contradiction between 2 books in the Bible, it's because of a different interpretation by the authors. Biblical inerrantists will probably not claim that, but there are people who think the Bible is handed down word of God, but will admit that there are errors in it. But Matthew 19:26 says, Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. So Matthew's directly contradicting himself here, where he's suggesting that it's not possible for God to take this away from Jesus. Anywho, on to verse 43. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the 3rd time. So this time he let them sleep, so that's nice of him. Then he returned to his disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So again, in Matthew and Mark, not so much in Luke, but Matthew and Mark, you can both see Jesus has a bit of a sarcastic side to him. He's a bit of a temper sometimes, which doesn't befit the Son of God, but it's perfectly understandable if he's just human. So you can see that the earlier Gospels didn't think of Jesus as being this perfect being who didn't make a single mistake in his life. They looked at him as being probably one of the most righteous and holy people that lived at the time, and so God adopted him as his son in order to make him the Messiah. You can see the legend growing around the man. And I'm not even going to get into whether or not Jesus actually existed. I think a good case can be made for him never having existed and Mark just being completely literary allegory and not based on historical fact. There is a lot to be said for that. But even if you do accept Jesus as a historical figure, it makes more sense that he's just a normal person. When the older Gospels, the ones that were written closer to when he would have actually been alive, are writing about him as if he's a normal person. But on to John. Okay, so John's version of Gethsemane is chapter 18, verse 1. Basically, one verse of Gethsemane. Because John's Jesus is the Son of God right from the get-go. There's no adoptionist thing going on here. John's Jesus is the Son of God. He's the perfect guy. He can't have his Jesus being tormented by the idea of being crucified. He's the Son of God. He's not tormented at all. He's going into it like a man. So John's version of Gethsemane is chapter 18, verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. And then right after that, it goes straight into his arrest story. So I'm going to, at this point, pop back over to Mark to cover the arrest. All right, the arrest story in Mark starts at chapter 14, verse 43. Jesus arrested. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. Now, this book makes it quite clear that Judas is one of the disciples, but depending on which book you're reading, it's not always quite crystal clear. Some of them... There are more than 12 disciples if you count all the names in all the books given, and the way they've typically dealt with that is that they'll combine, like Matthew gets combined with Levi, because in some books he's referred to as Matthew, and others he's referred to as Levi, and it's not that there's any clue that Matthew was given the name Levi or Levi was given the name Matthew. It's just that those are the two that don't match up, so they smush them together and assume that's something like a Simon Peter thing, even though it never explicitly says it. And similar things can happen with Judas. He's not always listed among the 12 in the books. But interesting thing here, in 1 Corinthians 15:5, where Paul is listing the appearances of Jesus after he was resurrected, one of the things he says is, and then to the 12, which everybody takes to mean the disciples. But what's interesting about that is that this was written before Acts, and Acts is the one where they choose Matthias to replace Judas. So this was written before anyone knew anything about Judas being replaced by anyone. So there would have only been 11 disciples for him to appear to at this point. So that's kind of interesting to note. Now, one of the theories on that I've heard is that the 12 that he's mentioning here are not the 12 disciples, because Paul never actually, this is the only time Paul could be said to mention the disciples. He never uses the word disciple. And this is the only reference that anyone can take to mean disciples, except when you look at the history of it, there was a sect of Judaism at the time. I believe it was the Ascetics. I'm not 100% sure on that, and I'm having a hard time finding the reference for it. I got the information from one of David Fitzgerald's books. It was either Nailed or Jesus Mything in Action. I listened to it on an audiobook, and I don't have a physical copy, and I can't just leaf through the audiobook to try and find where he mentioned it. But there was a sect of Judaism that had a council of 12 that was often referred to as the 12. So he could be referring to them in that passage rather than the 12 disciples. Another option is that could be a later insertion by a scribe who wanted to make it match up. Now, if it's the council, then that actually disagrees with the resurrection appearances as are listed in the Gospels. I mean, it kind of disagrees with it anyways, even if it is the disciples. But we'll get to that later. So yeah, I'm only half a verse into this so far, and I'm already rambling. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Okay, so why... If Jesus was as popular as the Gospels were saying, and he was preaching publicly in Jerusalem up to this point, why do they need someone to let them know who Jesus is? That just doesn't make any sense. And also, we'll notice here that the servant of the high priest gets his ear cut off by no one in particular, just by one of the people standing near. And Jesus doesn't do anything about that in this. Now, it could be said that he healed it and Mark just skipped over it. But that seems like a pretty important detail to miss, that some guy got his ear chopped off and then put back on by Jesus. Like one of the guys that was there to arrest him, Jesus healed him. That's a pretty important detail that they're leaving out here. On to verse 48. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled." So right there, it makes it quite clear that they would have known who Jesus was. Why did they need Judas to give him a symbol? Judas is one of these characters that adds more plot holes than he fills. Then everyone deserted him and fled. And now this is one of my favorite verses in Mark. Verse 51, "A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." And that's it. That's all we hear of that guy. Just out of nowhere, some guy runs away naked. I love that verse, and I wish I hadn't listened to... I shouldn't have listened to them back to back. It was Nailed and Jesus, Mything in Action by David Fitzgerald. Both excellent books. And unfortunately, he explains this one. This is one of Mark's literary devices that is actually quite brilliant. That man actually does show up later. He does not explicitly mention that it is that man, but if you're looking at it from a literary perspective, the symbolism is fairly strong. So this young man here is supposed to be symbolic for Jesus is losing his life at this point. So he's fleeing without his clothes, and often in ancient literature, the losing of clothes was a symbol for losing your life, for dying. So that's one of the hints that Mark is writing fiction, basically. He's not writing down events that actually happened. He's writing a story, and he's putting in literary elements that make the story interesting and compelling to those who look at it critically and try and break it down. And Mark is a literary genius. I think it works very well. I think, like, if you do have that sort of appreciation for it. But unfortunately, then the childish side of me doesn't get the hee there's a naked guy running around the garden. But enough of that. It's time to talk about Luke's arrest of Jesus. So this is chapter 22, verse 47. "While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and a man who was called Judas, one of the 12, so again, that's being specific, Judas is one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, 'Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?' When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, 'Lord, should we strike with our swords?' And one of them struck a servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear." Again, this is one of those things that, from a literary perspective, it works very well with them being confused. Should we strike? And maybe somebody striking in advance without waiting for permission. But think about how this would be happening. There's this big confusing mob coming up. They're not going to have time to say, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" It's just going to be like chaos. Someone's just going to pull their sword out and strike. That's what's going to happen. So that question doesn't make any sense if you're looking at this from a realistic perspective. But from a literary perspective, I think it works pretty well. But Jesus answered, "No more of this," and he touched the man's ear and healed him. So now we've got the healing of the ear of the servant. That was not put in Mark. You'd think that this would be an important detail to include. Jesus is healing one of the guys that's there to arrest him. That's quite a big detail to leave out. I don't see why Mark would have left that out if he was recording history and if that actually happened. Verse 52, "Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, 'Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay your hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns.'" So this is Jesus specifically saying that, this is your time. It's you are for the dark. And again, he's saying how he was in the courts preaching. They could have arrested him any time, but they chose to do it under cover of darkness, which it would actually have been very much against Jewish custom. It was actually against Jewish law. They wouldn't. This trial by night that they have is by the Jewish law of the time. It's illegal. They wouldn't have done it this way, which kind of shows that Mark, anyway, was not Jewish. He didn't really have good knowledge of the Jewish customs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's the end of the arrest section of Luke. Let's get on to Matthew. Matthew's arrest story starts in chapter 26, verse 47. "While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, so now this is all three of the synoptic gospels are agreeing that Judas was one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. 'The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him.' Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, 'Greetings, Rabbi,' and kissed him. Jesus replied, 'Friend, do what you came for.'" So again, this doesn't really make sense with the whole, at the end of the story where he's saying he was preaching in the synagogue, he was in public all the time, why didn't you come and get me then? even if they didn't come and get him then and they did wait till the cover of darkness, they wouldn't have needed Judas to point him out to them. Like, maybe they would have needed Judas to say where he would be, but even that wouldn't be that hard. According to the Bible, he was followed around by people all the time, so they'd just have to add a couple of their own people into the crowd, and there you go. No need for Judas. Okay, so this is verse 50. Jesus replied, "Friend, do what you came for." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" Now, Luke had Jesus tell them to bring swords, specifically, well, he didn't say why, but he specifically said to bring swords, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak to buy one, and 2 swords would be enough. But now here he's saying, put your sword back in its place, all who draw the sword will die by the sword, which, of course, isn't entirely true. There are people all throughout history that they were soldiers and generals and people who lived by the sword, but survived the battles and died of old age or other diseases and whatnot. So that can't be a literal claim right there. That has to be metaphorical. Either that or the Bible is just simply wrong. Okay, continuing on with verse 55. At that time Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Now, of the synoptic gospels, they've all mentioned that this is all taking place so that the scriptures may be fulfilled or the prophets may be fulfilled. But one thing I'm noticing is a distinct lack of superscripts with references to other prophecies. There are very few of those in here. So they're not saying which prophecies are being fulfilled by this. There is a lot of guesswork in that. Like, a lot of people think that the suffering servant passage from, I believe it's Isaiah, is talking about Jesus. Now, if you read the whole thing, it is clearly not talking about Jesus, but there are some things that look like they fit pretty well, so a lot of people think that it was that. And Mark definitely didn't have a problem with taking other scripture passages out of context and make them say things that they never did. But anyway, that's what I find interesting about that chapter. Now it's time to see what John has to say about the arrest. Now, John, as we pointed out in the last section, his whole section on Gethsemane is just one verse long. It's 18 verse 1. So 18 verse 2 is where the arrest starts. And, John couldn't have his tough guy Jesus being upset about the future. So now we'll see that he also can't have his tough guy Jesus being kissed by another man. So it doesn't even suggest that Judas had that signal worked out with the crowd that came to arrest him. So starting chapter 18, verse 2. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So right there, the wording there suggests that Judas is not one of the disciples. So it's Judas who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas knows the place because he's been following them around. So he has been a follower of Jesus, otherwise he couldn't be called a traitor. But it doesn't seem to be saying that Judas is one of the disciples, but he knew that Jesus met there with his disciples. So that seems like it's one of those things that it's public knowledge that, like, anyone who's been following the guy around could figure it out. But you don't have to be one of the disciples to do it. It just, John doesn't seem to be of the opinion that Judas was a disciple. Moving on, verse 3. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. So Judas was there, but he didn't actually do anything. Jesus came out and said, "I am he." This is John's badass Jesus. "I am the one you're looking for. I know you're gonna kill me brutally, but I don't care. I'm a tough guy. I can take it. Nah." When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So his "I am he" was so powerful, because he's tough guy Jesus, that they actually fell down when he said it. So verse 7, again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus answered. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." So he's giving orders to the people capturing him. Badass Jesus at the helm. "This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me." So that's a reference back to John 6:39. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus or Malchus. I like Malchus. Let's go with Malchus. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" So there's the reference to the cup again, but instead of this time saying, "Please, if it's possible, take this cup away from me, but I'm going to do your will anyways," this is badass Jesus saying, the Father gave me the cup, so I'm going to drink it. You can't do anything to stop that, so put your sword away. Like, what can I say? Jesus is a badass. He can't be no sissy boy Jesus and John. So that's it for the arrest story. Now, in the next bit, the Gospels all have it in a slightly different order. So I'm going to go with the order that they have it in Mark, since Mark is the earliest Gospel. So I'm going to start with the before the Sanhedrin section, which is called different things in different Gospels. So I might be reading the other Gospels out of order slightly, but that's because I'm going to be going with the order in Mark. So, Mark chapter 14, verse 53, before the Sanhedrin. Now, keep in mind, this is still the evening. This is after they've had the Last Supper. They've gone to Gethsemane. Then Jesus was arrested. He's taken straight to the Sanhedrin. There's no hint that they ever stopped for the night. So this is a trial by night, which was illegal according to Jewish custom at the time. So before the Sanhedrin, they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, elders, and teachers of the law came together. It's highly unlikely that all of them would have agreed to a trial by night at this point, especially right before the Passover and right before the Sabbath. They definitely would have wanted to just lock him up and just hold on to it until afterwards, because it wasn't allowed. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. And again, according to Jewish law, if the statements did not agree, they cannot condemn him, especially not to death. Then some stood up and gave false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another, not made by man." Yet even then their testimony did not agree. So still it's saying their testimony did not agree, so Jesus would not be able to be condemned. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." This isn't directly a contradiction, but it's talking about how Jesus remains silent. But then, like, one sentence later, Jesus has given them a full answer. Like, he's not just saying that, "Yes, I am the Son of the Blessed One." He's saying, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming in the clouds of heaven." Coming on the clouds of heaven, sorry. There's a lot of come either way. That's not him being silent. That's him answering the question. So what's the point in putting in the thing about him remaining silent? Well, that was so that they could say that he fulfilled the prophecy in Isaiah 53, specifically verse 7. "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." So he's got him being silent, but then at the same time, if he's silent, then they have no reason to convict him of anything, because as he made very clear, none of the testimony against him agreed, so they would not be able to convict him. So they had to have him say something that could be considered blasphemous. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to be convicted. So verse 63, "The high priest tore his clothes. 'Why do we need any more witnesses?' he asked. 'You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' They all condemned him as worthy of death." They all condemned him. That's everyone in the Sanhedrin, also known as the council. So this is the council. They have all unanimously condemned him. That will come back, remember it. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy!" And the guards took him and beat him. Okay, so that's it for the before the Sanhedrin section of Mark. Now it's time to get on to Luke. So Luke has the trial in a slightly different order than Mark, and it could be argued that Luke was trying to correct some of the errors that Mark made in Jewish custom and law. So, for instance, Luke has Peter disowning Jesus before the trial, whereas Mark has it after. Luke has the guards mock Jesus before the trial, whereas Mark has it after. So Luke is clearly putting some time in between Jesus being arrested and the trial commencing, because he knew that a trial by night was just flat out illegal and would never have happened. So Luke was fixing that little error when he reorganized things. So I'm going to start with the guards mock Jesus, which is chapter 22, verse 63. So this is skipping the Peter disowns Jesus section. We'll come back to that when we get to that in Mark. Chapter 22, verse 63. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and betraying him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. So he's putting this before the trial so that there's some time in between the arrest and the trial. So next comes Jesus before Pilate and Herod. But before he gets there, he starts off before the Sanhedrin and the Council of Elders and all that. Verse 66, At daybreak the council of the elders and the people, both their chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Christ," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you the Son of God?" He replied, "You are right in saying that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Well, they didn't really ask for any testimony in the story so far. So either he just kind of left that detail out because, again, he knew that conflicting testimony would have ended up with Jesus being declared innocent and free to go, or he just didn't see the importance in including it, so he just skipped over that detail. So that's it for Jesus with the Sanhedrin in Luke. Now it's time to move on to Matthew. So Matthew's section before the Sanhedrin starts in chapter 26, verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and whole Sanhedrin, that's the whole Sanhedrin, so all of them are there, were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. So again, they're having witnesses come forward whose testimony doesn't agree with each other. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. So again, they have him being silent earlier in order to fulfill the prophecy in Isaiah 53:7, but they can't have him actually be silent because then he wouldn't be convicted of anything, so he has to speak. So they're having their cake and eating it too. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied, "but I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." I hope they use Lysol wipes or something there. If they're coming all over those clouds, I don't want to go to heaven and sit on their sticky clouds. Sounds kind of gross. 65, verse 65. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you?" So again, this is very, very much not what would have happened at one of these trials. The council members and probably the high priest as well hitting him and spitting on him. No, they would have remained aloof, if anything. They might have had the guards doing that, but they definitely wouldn't have done that themselves, which is what is being said here. So, on to John. Let's see what he has to say about the Sanhedrin. So John has the story of him with the Sanhedrin and the high priests split up by the story of Peter's denial, which is also split up. So for this part, I'm going to be reading John 18, verses 12 through 14, followed by verses 19 through 24, also of chapter 18, because Peter's denial is chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. And then verse 25 through 27. So the order is a little bit funny here, but let's see how it goes. Chapter 18, verse 12, Jesus taken to Annas. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. John is the most anti-Semitic book in of the four Gospels, he often refers to the Jews, meaning the bad guys. So anytime you see Christians being anti-Semitic, you can probably count on them getting their anti-Semiticism from John. So skipping ahead to verse 19, the high priest questions Jesus. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. This is at his house, which would, again, that would have been highly irregular in Jewish custom at the time. So verse 20, I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. So again, this is one of the officials hitting him. They wouldn't have done that. That's just not the way these things were done. Is this the way you answer the high priest, he demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong, but if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas the high priest. So this was in Annas' house. Annas is the father-in-law of the high priest. So this isn't even, he's not even at the high priest yet. It actually kind of skips over Jesus being with Caiaphas. So like in the story, it seems like Caiaphas just takes him straight to Pilate. He doesn't question him himself. Well, anyway, that's the story of Jesus being questioned by the Jewish leaders, Sanhedrin, the council, the Jews, as John likes to put it. So on to Peter's denial. This is going to be a fun one where we see some very clear contradictions. So let's head over to Mark's version. So Mark's version of Peter disowning Jesus starts in chapter 14, verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. And there's a superscript C there that says some early manuscripts, entryway, and the rooster crowed. So that's not terribly important, but there's disagreement among the manuscripts over whether the rooster crowed once or twice or what have you. Not a serious disagreement there, but it still calls into question the idea that this is the perfect word of God handed down as intended. So, verse 69, when the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again, he denied it. So keep in mind there, this is the same person who called him out on it the first time. It's the same servant girl. It says she said again. So this is the same person who said the first time, you also were with that Nazarene Jesus, and he denied it. She's saying it again. And again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. Now, there's no mention of how they know he's a Galilean here. It could be his accent, but it doesn't explicitly say that. So I'm thinking that in the later books, when it mentions his accent, that was them correcting Mark, what they saw as a mistake in Mark, where he didn't specify how they knew he was Galilean. Verse 71, he began to call curses down on himself, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. So the important thing about the Peter disowns Jesus story is who is asking him whether or not he was with Jesus. So in this case, it's the servant girl of the high priest asking the first 2 times, and then those standing nearby after she had already asked them. It was the people that heard the conversation first, like just someone from the crowd or a few people from the crowd asking him the 3rd time. So keep that in mind. I will reference back to that when I get to the other versions. So for Luke's version of the Peter disowns Jesus story, we're backtracking a little bit. When he was in front of the Sanhedrin, that was chapter 22, verse 63 through 71. So this time we're in 22, verse 54 through 62. So starting at verse 54. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, but when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, this man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him, he said. So far, so good. It's agreeing it's a servant of the high priest, a servant girl for the high priest that's saying this guy was with him, and he's denying it. It's different wording, but, I could see that being the same story told from 2 different perspectives. But then 58, a little later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. Then he said, man, I am not, Peter replied. Sorry. So you also are one of them. Man, I am not. So not only is this a different person, whereas in Mark it was the same girl asking twice, this is a man. He specifically says, "Man, I am not." So it's not like it's just referring to some other girl and it could be the same girl just referring to it in a weird way. This is a gender swap. So unless she had a sex change in between these sentences, it's a completely different person. And then about an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." And again, it doesn't mention how he knows he's a Galilean, but this is an hour later. The other one made it sound like in Mark, it sounded like it was all just like one conversation between Peter, the girl, and then a few people that overheard the conversation. Whereas this is splitting it up to where it's completely different people are recognizing him in completely different contexts. I mean, I guess an hour could have elapsed in the version in Mark, and he just didn't mention it, which isn't that important. But again, the key thing here is to look at who is accusing him of being a disciple of Jesus. So verse 60, Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. So we got a little dramatic flair there where Mark just had him deny him and then move on. This time Jesus makes eye contact with him when the rooster crows and Peter realizes what he did. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you'll disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. So that's the story as it's found in Luke. Now it's time to move on to Matthew. So Matthew's story is in chapter 26, starting at verse 69. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. So again, this is agreeing that it's a servant girl that's asking him the first time, but he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another girl saw him. So this is a different girl, and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." So not only is it a different girl, it's a girl. So whereas in Luke, it was not only a different person, it was a man, whereas this is a different person who's a girl. So far we don't have a single agreement among any of the Gospels. So we're in the Synoptic still, the Synoptic Gospels being Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there's no agreement so far on who was accusing Peter of being with Jesus. Or another girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow is Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you're one of them, for your accent gives you away." So this is Matthew correcting the mistakes of the other two, where they don't show how they know he's a Galilean. So he put in there that it was his accent, and that's what gives it away. So he's adding plausibility to the story. Now, that's not to say that the other two didn't mean his accent, but this is clearly an instance of a later author correcting plot holes that he saw in a previous story. Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately the rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you'll disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. So the story itself is very similar among the 3 synoptic gospels. It's just who is accusing him of being a disciple of Jesus just doesn't agree at all, and it's irreconcilable. Like, doesn't matter what context you're looking at it, a man is not a girl. I mean, unless they were incredibly progressive for the time and they were fully aware that gender identity does not necessarily line up with physical sex, and some were referring to this person as a man and some were referring to this person as a girl, depending on whether they were referring to her identity or her physical appearance. Something tells me that they weren't that aware of the whole trans thing back then. Now let's see what John has to say. So in John, they have Peter's denial split up into his first denial, which is chapter 18, verse 15 through 18, and Peter's second and third denials, which are chapter 18, verse 25 through 27. So I'm just going to read this all as one, since we've already read the part that splits them up. Verse 15, Simon Peter and another disciple, so that would be the disciple Jesus loves, the one who is never actually mentioned in the book. Everybody assumes it's John, but it's never... There's nothing that actually tells you that it was John, and John didn't write the book anyway, so it's not like it matters. But of course, there's a little bit of a pissing contest going on between Peter and the other disciple who's unnamed. We get to the race to the tomb later, but right here we have Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, so he's got friends in high places, so he can get places where Peter can't by himself. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You are not one of the man's disciples, are you?" the girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. So that's a door guard girl, which I guess you could call a servant of the high priest. So we could say that this agrees with the other three gospels, that the first person to question him was a servant of the high priest, but she's not actually saying, "You're a disciple," and him saying, "No, I'm not." She's just guarding the door and saying, "So you weren't with that guy, like you're not one of his disciples, are you?" And he's just saying no. And, okay, move along. So skipping ahead to verse 25, Peter's second and third denials. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." Now, this doesn't say anything about who asked him, so that could have been the servant girl again, so that might have agreed with Mark, but I doubt it because she was supposed to be at the door, apparently. So, but, that could agree with Luke as well. That could have been a man. Verse 26, one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. So this is specifically, it's a person who was a relative of the guy who got his ear chopped off, asking him at this point. Whereas in the other Gospels, at this point, it was just a random person in the crowd, or it was the crowd as a whole. So there's no reconciling who's asking Peter about his identity, whether or not he was a follower of Christ. So that, to me, that's an irreconcilable contradiction. So the biblical inerrancy is out the window at this point. Okay, so that's it for part 2. I'm close enough to the end of the story that I'll probably be able to get through the rest of it in part 3, so we can have the whole Easter story in time for Easter. Yay! Well, remember to follow me on Twitter and Facebook and support me on Patreon. See you next time.